This is Gabrielle Bastian for Regeneration International, and we are here today at the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization's headquarters in Rome. So we're here for the Global Symposium on Soil Organic Carbon, which is a unique scientific meeting bringing together 500 delegates from around the world to review the role of soils and soil organic carbon in the context of climate change. So we are very privileged to be here today with two scientists who just gave keynote presentations here at the symposium. So we have with us Dr. Rattan Lal, who is Professor of Soil Science and Director of the Carbon Management and Sequestration Center at Ohio State University. Dr. Lal is a world-acclaimed expert on soil carbon sequestration and climate change, who has received numerous awards for his work, notably from the Soil and Water Conservation Society and from the International Union of Soil Scientists. Dr. Lal, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
So here with us also is Dr. Thomas Crowther, who is a Marie Curie Fellow at Yale University and the Netherlands Institute of Ecology. Dr. Crowther is a scientific advisor to the UN's Billion Tree Campaign and to the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative, and he was recently awarded the Early Career Scientist Award for the International Soil Ecology Society. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us today. So we'll start by some general questions to put things in context for the audience. So, Dr. Lal, according to your research, what would be the potential for global sequestration of carbon into soils yearly, if under good soil stewardship?
Thank you for that very good question. If we take the croplands of the world, which are about 1.5 billion hectares globally speaking, most of these croplands have lost really 1/3 to 1/2 of the original carbon stock. And some soils of the developing countries, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, the Andean region, resource-poor farmers, the soils have lost maybe 60, 70, 80% of the original carbon pool. So these soils, if we can reverse the management of those lands, we can adopt improved management rather than the conventional low resource input agriculture, and we can create a positive carbon budget through conservation agriculture, through integrated nutrient management, through residue mulching, through cover cropping, through erosion control, through water management. It's possible to sequester somewhere between 1/2 ton per hectare to 1 ton. Globally, cropland we can sequester somewhere between 0.8 gigaton to about 1 gigaton of carbon per year. This is cropland.
Okay.
In addition to cropland, of course, we have grazing land. So grazing land is area globally is about double than that of cropland. So 1.5 billion versus 3 billion hectare. But grazing lands are more in drier climate, arid climate. The rate of carbon sequestration, my estimate, is a little bit lower.
Okay.
So on a 3 billion hectare, we can probably sequester another between 0.8 to 1 billion ton per year, globally speaking.
Okay.
If we were to select the best priority area, we have degraded lands of the world. And degraded lands are lands which are eroded, salinized, they are deficit in water, nutrients. If we can restore those degraded lands, there the sink capacity is even greater because those soils are depleted. So UNCCD's idea of restoring degraded land, desertified land, that's a good potential there. I think policy intervention are important. I think one part which is important, potential is one thing, achieving that potential is another. And that achieving required to make sure that the farmers, land managers are compensated for the ecosystem services that we expect them to generate. They have to make investment. And therefore the society as a whole should pay them, compensate them to realize their potential.
Thank you. Yes, that's a very important point.
Yeah, it's an important
point. They need to be rewarded for
They have to be rewarded.
that regenerative
There's a
work.
cost involved.
Thank you for this response. So I have a question for you, Dr. Crowther. So to inform the audience of some of your most recent work, can you describe what processes cause the loss of soil carbon, and what are the most defining variables in soil carbon loss?
Okay, it's obviously at a global scale a really complicated issue, and it's something that contributes a huge amount of uncertainty to our ability to project climate change into the future, because carbon loss is obviously a major driver of global change, and fluctuations in the size of the global carbon pool are a really prominent control on atmospheric carbon concentrations and also the climate. And as you mentioned, there's a range of different global change processes that might impact carbon sequestration at a global scale. And we're not entirely sure of the balance of these processes at the moment, but things like rising temperatures can stimulate microbial activity in the soil, leading to the loss of carbon into the atmosphere. At the same time, elevated CO2 might increase plant uptake of carbon, driving a feedback that will increase carbon uptake. So that has the potential to sort of minimize those effects of the warming-induced losses. And there's also other things like nutrient enrichment and drought, where we have very little understanding of the sort of net balance in global carbon stocks at a global scale. But at the moment, the most damaging impacts that we've seen on global carbon sequestration come as a result of land use change and deforestation in the tropics, where the removal of vegetation and the depletion of resources leads to the loss of carbon from those ecosystems and the degradation of those ecosystems. And so that at the moment is the primary driver, but as global change, as climate change progresses over the rest of the century, those other factors are going to come in and sort of interactively affect carbon sequestration over the rest of the century, and that's going to be a really important thing for us to be able to get our heads around if we're going to be able to predict climate change over the rest of the century.
And so, according to your research, what was the most defining variable of soil carbon loss under warming?
Okay, so in our analysis we were exploring specifically how warming does influence carbon sequestration, because this seems like it's going to be a really important global change driver. And what we actually found is that warming does have impacts around the world, but the characteristic that determines how sensitive those soil carbon stocks are to warming is actually the amount of carbon that's stored in the soil in the first place. So areas with huge standing carbon stocks are increasingly vulnerable to warming, whereas those that have smaller carbon stocks, maybe they're areas that were less temperature limited in the past, they're areas that in the lower latitudes where there's lower soil carbon storage at the moment, those are less vulnerable. But it's those high latitude regions where we've got huge carbon stocks, and we're also likely to experience the greatest amount of warming over the rest of the century, that we're going to get increasingly greater carbon losses from the soil unless we do something about it.
So Dr. Lal, in light of these findings of Dr. Crowther about the fact that larger carbon stocks are more vulnerable to soil carbon loss under warming, this raises the question of the stability of the carbon stocks. So what do you feel is the largest opportunity to sequester carbon in a stable way?
First of all, let me say that what he said is very correct. As the temperature goes up, I mentioned Arrhenius' law. The temperature goes up, we have what we call quotient, Q10 coefficient. It can double the rate of increase of decomposition with every 10 degrees centigrade. But the good part of the whole thing is that management is possible. For example, I used to work in sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria. I had experiments throughout West Africa. When I was able to put a mulch on the ground and a cover crop, the temperature of the soil at 5 centimeter depth could be probably 30 degrees centigrade. But when the ground few meter away was not mulched and it was bare, open, plowed, with no cover, with no mulch, nothing, the temperature might be 50 degrees centigrade. A 20-degree difference simply because of management. So management-induced changes in soil temperature can moderate the impact. And that is where intervention on science-based is very important. So wherever the temperature goes up, is it possible to moderate that through soil, plant, water, pasture management? And the answer to that is yes. And that is why, while we must understand the risks we must also understand the opportunities that science brings to us. And here we are talking about how to make better agriculture as a solution to the problem. And I think this is where 30 years ago, since we started the work on soil carbon, this last 3, 4, 5 years, COP21, COP22, and COP23, now we are trying to make agriculture and soil as an integral to the solution. To me, that's a very fortunate, optimistic paradigm shift, and we must utilize that. So the data does exist, yes. Temperature-induced moderation of decomposition rate is important, but at the same time, management information also exists, provided we can motivate, incentivize farmers, especially the resource poor farmer, to adopt those practices that moderate the temperature. One other part which is very important to recognize, we always talk about the bad thing that the climate change is going to happen. Mother Nature never does anything which is always just only bad, bad, bad. Winners are going to be those who look for opportunities which will be created. And those opportunities are going to be there. There are going to be certain conditions where CO2 enrichment, where warming up in a northern climate will increase the agronomic and biomass productivity. And therefore we should also, while we protect what we have, we must also look for opportunities and this is where the science is. That's what adaptation is. Adaptation simply does not mean, it also means looking for other opportunities. It's both. Minimizing risk, but at the same time, opportunities that are brought in, both. So yes, temperature is very important. Yes, we can manage it too.
Definitely. That's wonderful. So thank you for this. And so in closing, a question for you both. Where do you think what do you think are the key pieces of information that are missing to better inform global policy on soil organic carbon sequestration? Where should we really focus our research efforts next to have more informed policy?
Well, from my perspective, I think that actually, feeding off Rattan's comment, I entirely agree. The only reason for understanding the impacts of climate change is so that we can figure out the best strategies for mitigating it and fighting against it. Conservation needs this understanding of what's going to happen if we're going to be able to make effective management strategies. So from my perspective, I still think we're a long way from understanding how carbon stocks are going to change over the rest of the century. And really, the one key thing that's lacking is real ground source data from the field, from climate change experiments, global change experiments around the world. There's a huge amount of data out there, but there's just not enough. It hasn't been compiled effectively yet, and in fact we need a lot more global change experiments in the field to be able to sort of bring that information together. So I would say that data availability and accessibility is currently our biggest limiting factor to understanding sequestration at a global scale, and then that's going to inform policy decisions and effective management strategies for fighting against climate change.
Yeah, that's very correct. We need long-term experimental data under real-world situation. Most of the existing experiments were not really set up to see the impact of soil management carbon on climate change and carbon sequestration. We took the existing experiments on cropping system, crop rotation, grazing, and began to use that. This is a time to set up long-term experiment at the real data. The other important part is that carbon sequestration per se is important and we need to do, but there are other things which are related to it. And these are the ancillary benefits, additional benefits, food security, nutritional security. 795 million people are food insecure. 2 billion people are nutritionally insecure. They suffer from micronutrient deficiency, other thing. All of those depend on the soil health. And there's a critical level of soil organic carbon, like 1.5 to 2%, which must be maintained for a healthy soil to produce healthy food. So that's one part. We should not forget the food security part of carbon sequestration. Water. Soil organic matter is an important component for increasing the water holding capacity of the soil. The drought-prone soil, which are going to happen with climate change, what is the solution? Have more soil organic matter in it to retain more water. Biodiversity, very important part. Soil is the largest reservoir pool of biodiversity. The food for microorganism in soil is soil organic matter.
Absolutely.
That is very important. Did you know that 95% of all the antibiotics that human and animal take come from microorganism in soil? And their food is soil organic matter. So many benefits. So these other benefits, we should not forget it. And when you look at the entire totality of the impact, if you remember, I had a pyramid. Food security, biodiversity, water renewability, all those are very important reasons to sequester carbon.
Absolutely.
Not just the climate.
It's not just the carbon.
Not
It's
just
not
the
just the
climate.
climate change.
And
impacts.
that is the important part. So when we have to talk to the policymakers, we're not simply saying climate change mitigation, yes, but the soil carbon brings us many other ancillary benefits which we cannot ignore.
It's a
This is a
win-win.
truly win-win-win-win.
Absolutely.
It's a bridge to the future until the no carbon or low carbon fuel sources take effect,
Yes.
which have to happen. In the meantime, soil of the world has lost 80 to 100 gigaton. Let's put it back
Right.
while we are looking for no carbon fuel sources.
Well, I would just add to that. I absolutely wholeheartedly agree. You know, we're focusing on climate change here, but the benefits of soil organic carbon sequestration come with increased food production, improving economic benefits for local communities, especially for people who you know are most closely connected to the land, and obviously biodiversity. But I was going to ask you, do you think that any one of these in particular might be the sort of linchpin in our argument for improving or for getting land managers and conservationists into sequestration at a global scale, or do you think it's the full package?
You know, the food security I mentioned is very critical. But most of the 500 million farmers of the world who grow more food for large population than the large scale of farmers in the developing, they are resource poor. They are poor people. Alleviating poverty, improving productivity from 1 ton per hectare to 3 tons or 4 tons per hectare will alleviate the poverty of those people. The sustainable development goals empower women. 60 to 70% of the farmers in developing countries are women. How can you empower them without improving their productivity? So, sustainable development goals of water renewability, empowering women, ending hunger, increasing social equity, those goals also cannot be met without improving the health of the soil, for which the essential ingredient is organic matter content. So this is, so it's not just one part. I think there are so many other things. Sometimes we forget that climate change is the only part of soil carbon. Other parts which are equally important.
Absolutely. Soils are the basis of everything, so it's definitely not just for climate, it's a win-win.
It's a right direction to go.
Focus on soil health. And just to cycle back very quickly to the lack of data, do you feel that there are specific areas in the world or specific biomes in which we should be gathering more data because there is a discrepancy between the availability of data in those areas? So to come up with more complete global models.
Certainly. So at the moment we're drastically lacking information about the influence of global change factors on sequestration in the tropics and in the southern hemisphere. We've got a growing amount of information, still nowhere near enough, but a growing amount of information about these processes in the northern hemisphere. This is, you know, it's not, that's been sort of facilitated by the fact, firstly, there's a lot of, you know, prominent universities and sort of research institutes in the northern hemisphere that are doing their research in their local areas, but it's also useful because those are the regions with the highest standing carbon stocks. As you move to the highest latitudes, those are where the temperature has been so cold that decomposition rate has been stifled, and so carbon has been stored for long periods of time. So we are covering a lot of the most important parts of the world, but there's a growing body of evidence suggesting that actually carbon storage in the tropics, particularly tropical forests and in tropical grasslands, could be much, much higher than what we actually think. And in fact, we need to expand our understanding of how global change factors are influencing carbon sequestration in those areas before we can start to begin to think about management strategies.
Very interesting.
This is very correct. Northern latitudes, We have a soil which are very rich in carbon. We must protect it. This tropical region, 23 degree north and south of the equator, these are the soils which are most depleted. That's where the population is not only very dense now, but also increasing. That's where we must focus to increase it and hold it. So those are the areas which are really very, tropics especially. We cannot lift the poverty of the tropical and 90% of the future increase in population is going to happen there. Therefore, those are the hotspots.
Yeah,
That's where the focus has to go.
I second that. The tropics being the highest areas of biodiversity that we need to conserve, the most important for human productivity and supporting human populations. These are certainly the areas where we need to focus this research and improve our management strategies for increased carbon sequestration.
The other day we were meeting in Marrakesh, when the COP22. The population of Africa right now is about 1 billion people. In 1800, it was 0.1 billion people. Right now, 2016, it's 1 billion. By 2100, it'll be 4.4 billion people. 44 time increase. That's going to happen in Africa. Same thing in South Asia. Same thing elsewhere in the tropical world. We cannot possibly ignore them. But at the same time, the large-scale production in the northern latitude, fertile soil, young soil, productive soil, we must protect them. But to restore, improve the soil of the tropics, 23 degree north and south, that's where the major population pressure is at. That's where the resources are limited. We really got to go forward.
And another benefit of focusing on the tropics is that we've been talking about the soil, but obviously there's a huge amount of carbon that's sequestered in vegetation and in trees. And actually in the tropics that you see by far the greatest productivity in terms of forests and vegetation growth and food production. So if we can focus on increasing sequestration in those regions, there's going to be a whole load of other benefits that come with it associated with increased forest productivity and carbon sequestration.
Well, gentlemen, this has been incredibly useful and interesting. Thank you so much for joining us today. So we were with Dr. Rattan Lal, Professor of Soil Science at Ohio State University, and Dr. Thomas Crowther, Mary Curie Fellow at the Netherlands Institute of Ecology. This was Gabrielle Bastian for Regeneration International, and we are live at the Global Symposium on Soil Organic Carbon at the UNFAO headquarters in Rome. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you
very much.
Very nice.
Thank you so
Very
much.
nice.
This is
Very
great.
good. You are a good reporter. Very nice.
Thank you.
Very good. Very good.